Charlie was old for a horse. He was very experienced. He knew about people, and he knew about harness, and he knew lots of tricks for getting a stubborn load moving. Charlie was big for a horse. He would have looked right at home, bearing a knight in full armor in King Arthur's day. His feet were as big as dinner plates. Charlie was white. Charlie lived in Canton, Massachusetts. Charlie had been working fairly steadily for the farmer who owned him, but then the farmer retired. There was nothing left for Charlie to do. Charlie spent his days drowsing in the pasture, cropping the lush grass. At night he nodded in his box stall. Nobody seemed to begrudge him the hay in his manger or the oats in his wooden bucket, but nobody paid much attention to him either. Fortunately, Charlie wasn't one of those high-strung, hot-blooded horses that needs a lot of pampering. Charlie was doing okay, but he was bored. Once in a while, the farmer's 14-year-old granddaughter would come to the fence. Sometimes she brought carrots, and Charlie would amble over and gently lip the treats from her small hands and let her scratch his ears and his forehead under his forelock. When she thought no one was looking, she would clamber onto Charlie's broad back and lie there with her cheek on Charlie's mane and her arms as far around Charlie's neck as they would reach. Charlie couldn't have understood a conversation that took place one day on the farmer's porch. "You see, the thing is, we've good granite stone for the facing over there in Sharon and Moyle's Quarry, and we've the rail line to bring the stone to the work site. The project engineers, McNeil and Whistler, they worked it out that since it's all downhill from Sharon, the stone will get to the viaduct fine using gravity. But somehow we've got to get the empty car back up to the siding in Sharon for refilling so it can run down again." The farmer nodded. "That sounds like a sensible plan. You going to use a horse or a mule?" "Well, we would, but you see, our budget is tight and we can't find a beast we can afford." "Grandpa?" The girl on the railing was paying close attention. "What about Charlie? He could take the empty car back to Sharon, couldn't he? He's not too old to pull an empty car, and I'm sure he's bored." "A horse bored? What an idea! I declare, Jen, you do take the oddest fancies." "Just a moment. Is she saying you might have a horse we could use?" Mr. McDougall was listening carefully. "Well, Jen is right. I do have an old draft animal who's idle just now. There's nothing the matter with him. It's just he's old, and I hardly use him now I've stopped farming." Jen led the visitor around to the pasture. Charlie ambled over. "This is Charlie," Jenny said to Mr. McDougall, scratching the horse under the forelock. "I'm sorry, Charlie, I didn't bring you anything this time." "Grandpa thinks Charlie's 24 years old, Mr. McDougall." "Near enough," said the farmer, who had come up behind them. "He's a good worker, steady, nothing phases him. Been sound all his life, too." "Let me talk with Whistler," the Scotsman said. "I'm sure he'll make you a lease offer that's fair. When can I send a driver down for him?" That is how it happened that Charlie would work again. The next morning the farmer took Charlie down to the blacksmith shop, and Charlie stood patiently, resting his soft, prickly nose on the small of the blacksmith's back as his old friend trimmed and shaped his hooves. The smell of the forge and the creak of the leather apron and the clang of the hammer on the anvil were very familiar. When each shoe was ready, the smith placed it carefully on Charlie's hoof, drove the nails in, and clenched off the ends. The blacksmith chatted with Grandpa, bragging, as he always did, that Paul Revere used to sit on the stool Grandpa was sitting on while his horse was shod. Early the next morning, Donald, a young driver with a Scots brogue even thicker than Mr. McDougall's, came into the barn to get Charlie. Instead of taking him out to the pasture, the strange young man with the soft voice surprised Charlie by brushing him and picking out his feet, humming while he worked. Donald fetched Charlie's harness from the tack room, settled it across Charlie's back, and did up all the buckles and straps. He coaxed the bit into Charlie's mouth and pulled his ears through the bridle. As he straightened the reins, Donald was startled to hear a sweet, clear voice speak to the old horse. "You're off to work again, Charlie." Jen offered a carrot, and Charlie lifted up and tongued it past the bit and between his back teeth with a deftness born of long experience. "Aye, we're aboot ready. Will he carry me, think you?" "Sure. My father used to ride him to school." Charlie stood stock still by the mounting block while Donald climbed onto him. Suddenly, Charlie shook himself. The shake started at his head and worked right down his white body towards his tail, for all the world like a wet dog. Donald nearly fell off. "What on earth was that all about?" Donald exclaimed. "I think he had an itch," Jen said, thinking that Donald was pretty good to have stayed on, and that she liked listening to his Scots burr. Donald gathered up the reins and clucked, and Charlie stepped out, his new shoes clinking on the gravel. Jen waved as they went out onto the road toward the unfinished viaduct. Charlie didn't know that he was heading for the last link in the new Boston and Providence Railroad. By 1835, the stone bridge would carry the rails high above the east branch of the Neponset River. At the unfinished viaduct, Donald slid off and fastened Charlie's harness to an empty flatbed car. Charlie stepped in between the railroad tracks in front of the light car. Even with Donald perched on the front of it, it wasn't half as heavy as a load of hay, such as Charlie was used to hauling. It was 4.5 miles from the viaduct to Sharon Heights siding. Charlie made the trip in 2 hours. When they got to Sharon Heights, Donald gave Charlie a nosebag filled with oats, and he sat next to Charlie in the shade and ate his own lunch of bread and cheese and an apple. Donald gave Charlie the apple core, which Charlie took with his usual dignity. Donald led Charlie over to a watering trough. Charlie drank thirstily, but not too much. He looked around curiously, water dripping from his whiskery muzzle. A big wagon full of granite was standing next to the siding. The 2 oxen which pulled it were not interested in Charlie. They wore a wooden yoke and had brass balls on the ends of their horns. Donald used the edge of the trough to climb onto Charlie's back. He rode Charlie home. Carrying Donald was even easier than pulling the empty car, and the way was downhill, so Charlie swung along cheerfully back home. "That's enough for a first day, old lad," Donald told him as he stripped off the sweaty harness and gave Charlie a rub-down. Donald poured Charlie some oats, and Charlie polished them off, chasing the last few grains around his bucket, as Donald picked up his feet one after the other to check the new shoes and look for stones. Charlie was glad to be led out to the pasture. It was just as well that Donald wasn't looking. When Charlie creakily lowered himself to the ground in a nice dusty spot and grunted as he stretched his neck out in the dust. Eager to get rid of the feel of the harness, Charlie struggled to roll and eventually managed to swing his legs up and over. Charlie stuck his legs out in front of him, briefly sitting like a dog, and then with a heave, he got his hind legs under him. As he had that morning, Charlie shook himself, and clouds of dust rose from him, but he still looked like a splotchy brown horse. Later that evening, the farmer came out and led Charlie into the barn. "Look at you, old man, you're a mess!" Charlie slept well that night. Next morning, Donald was back early. Charlie looked at him in astonishment as Donald repeated the process of getting him ready. The scent of carrot came to Charlie's nose, and he snuffled at Donald's pants pocket. I almost forgot," Donald said, digging out the carrot and holding it out for Charlie. "I saw yesterday ye were fond of carrots." As Charlie walked out to the mounting block, he felt a little stiff. He hadn't walked as far as he had yesterday in a very long time. But he soon limbered up. Again, Charlie carried Donald up to the viaduct. Again, Charlie walked between the rails, pulling the empty car, and Donald, up to Sharon Heights. The rest of the summer fell into a pattern like the first few days. Most weekdays, Charlie made 2 trips to Sharon Heights. Eventually, the span of the viaduct over the Neponset River was finished. Charlie was mildly surprised the first day Donald failed to come for him, but he enjoyed his day off just the same. It was later in the morning than usual, the day Donald finally came back. Donald hung his coat on a nail in the barn and took Charlie out of his stall, but he didn't start putting his harness on. Instead, he cross-tied Charlie in the middle of the barn aisle and began grooming him, and not just a lick and a promise either. Charlie hadn't been brushed this thoroughly in years. Not only that, but Donald combed out his mane and tail too, picking out a few burrs. He tut-tutted when he noticed that Charlie's white tail was rather dirty, and Charlie was really surprised when Donald brought a bucket of water and some soap and started shampooing Charlie's tail. In fact, he was so surprised that he shifted his hindquarters over and tried to pull his tail out of the water, but Donald had a firm grip on it and kept on sudsing and rinsing. When he was finished, Donald let go, and Charlie gave him a good swipe in the face with the clean, wet tail. After carefully using a hoof pick on Charlie's feet, Donald went over to his coat and pulled a tin and a rag out of the pocket. Charlie was too amazed to move while Donald polished his hooves. Donald stood back to admire his work. Charlie looked magnificent. The extra muscle he'd made trudging back and forth to Sharon filled out his gleaming white hide. Just then, Jenny came into the barn. She stopped still, gazing. "He looks wonderful! I have an idea. I'll be right back." She was right back. In her hand, she carried a fistful of red, white, and blue ribbons, which she began to braid into Charlie's clean, damp tail. Charlie just stood there and let her do it. This was Jen, after all, and he was getting used to surprises by now. Jen saved out a couple of ribbons and fashioned them into a sort of rosette which she tied to the side of Charlie's halter. The span over the Neponset River was complete. A lot of people were gathered at the sides of the track on each side of the viaduct. There was a speaker's platform, bright with red, white, and blue bunting, and even a small band. Charlie paid no attention to the speakers, but he did prick his ears at the band. Charlie followed quietly when Donald led him out to the middle of the track. One of the flatbed stone cars Charlie had pulled for miles and miles was sitting empty on the tracks. At the back, someone had built a sort of wooden ramp. Donald led Charlie up to it. Charlie stopped. He wasn't going to put his feet on that flimsy thing. Donald tugged. Charlie tugged back. Donald coaxed. Charlie might as well have grown roots from his polished hoofs. Donald bent and picked up one of Charlie's feet and put it down on the beginning of the ramp. Charlie picked it up and put it back on the ground. A couple of the stoneworkers came over and put their shoulders to his rump. Charlie didn't move. He didn't kick either. Donald was starting to sweat. "Come on, old lad, step up." Charlie stood still. Jenny came over. "Let me try." She pulled a carrot out of the pocket of her dress. Donald gave her the lead line, and Jenny let Charlie smell the carrot, but she held it just out of his reach. She took a step up to the ramp. Charlie stretched out his neck. "Try putting his foot on the ramp again," Jenny suggested. Donald placed one of Charlie's front feet on the boards, and Charlie left it there. Jenny waved the carrot under Charlie's outstretched nose and took another step up the ramp. Charlie shifted his weight onto the foot Donald had moved. Nothing bad happened. Jenny made a kissy noise and took another step. Charlie put his other foot on the ramp. Jenny broke off a piece of the carrot and gave it to him. She took another step up the ramp. Charlie made a grumpy noise in his nose and followed Jenny up onto the flatbed car. Charlie looked around at the bridge and the people from this unfamiliar height. A crowd of workmen stood behind the flatbed car and started to push it. As it began to move, Charlie was startled and splayed his legs out to keep his balance. He rolled his eyes. Jenny murmured to him and continued to scratch. Donald kept a strong hand on the halter. As the flatbed crossed the span over the Neponset River, everyone cheered and shouted, "Charlie! Charlie!" Charlie was higher in the air than he had ever been before, but he was with two people he trusted, and he had seen a lot in his long life. He just stood there as the wheels rolled along the iron rails and the car carried him across to the other side. The ribbons in his tail and on his halter fluttered in the breeze. Charlie had no idea that he was being honored by being the first to cross the newly completed viaduct, but Jenny and Donald and Grandpa and everyone else knew, and they cheered and cheered. When the car stopped on the siding on the far side of the river, some of the workmen brought the ramp over. But Charlie wasn't having it. He saw his chance and, agile as a cat, jumped down onto the ground. Donald jumped down with him and then helped Jenny, who still held the lead rope. Donald and Jenny led Charlie a little ways to the side, and both of them held on to him firmly. Standing on the track, heading back the way Charlie had come, was a very large, smelly, and noisy machine. Charlie didn't know it was a steam locomotive, ready to make the first train crossing. Clouds of coal smoke came out of the stack as the big wheels began to move. By this time, Charlie was beyond astonishment, and he just trembled a little as the big engine chugged past him. He didn't even bolt when the train blew its steam whistle, though it was the loudest sound he'd ever heard. Charlie never worked again. Sometimes Jenny and Donald came to see him. Later, his two human friends brought with them a tiny warm bundle, which smelled sort of like Jenny and sort of like milk. Sometimes, as Charlie dozed in the pasture, he would hear a noise far away, a noise he had first heard on that confusing day at the viaduct when he rode on his own flatbed car. It was a sort of chugging noise. Next would come the long, drawn-out wail of the train whistle. Charlie would lift his head and prick his ears until the whistle faded into the distance. Then he would go back to grazing. There really is a Canton Viaduct, and it really was built by McNeil and Whistler. It really does have granite facing, which was quarried in Sharon, Massachusetts. The stone really did roll down to the Canton construction site on flatbed cars by gravity. There really was an old white horse named Charlie, and he really did pull the empty stone cars back up to the station at Sharon Heights. He really did get to be the first one to cross the finished span in 1835. The rest of this story comes from my imagination. Grown-ups might want to know that Engineer McNeil had a sister who married Engineer Whistler and became the mother of James McNeil Whistler, the painter. She was Whistler's mother.